Welcome to another edition of Under the Radar. I'm your host Atul Aneja. Over the next few minutes, we will go over to an event which the media hardly covered, but in my view, it was of exceptional importance because it was really part of a much bigger competition in the soft power domain, in the cultural domain between countries, especially India and China. And what am I talking about? This event was really this conference on Vajrarayana Buddhism. It was an international conference which took place at an important place, and I will explain to you later why it is so important. The place is Bhutan, and the conference took place in the capital of Bhutan, which is Thimpu. Now, this conference was attended by about 450 experts on Buddhism, and among them about 250 were experts from abroad. And who were the sponsors? There were two organizations from Bhutan who sponsored the event. And then there is the International Buddhism Confederation, or IBC, which is based in India. So this is an event on Buddhism, but I would say soft power, which took place in Bhutan. Now let's work backwards. Why is it important? Why was this conference so pivotal? Now, if we really go into the depths of it, we are all familiar that there is a geopolitical competition which is going on between India and China. There are several geographies involved in this. We can see it in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN countries, in a more pronounced way in South Asia, where Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives. We're all familiar with that. The whole Indian Ocean, in fact, or the Indo-Pacific, if to put it in a more modern nomenclature. But this is a geo-cultural competition, which is completely beneath the radar, which has been taking place between India and China for quite some time. Now, we all know that Buddhism traditionally spread from India, went to China, and from China it moved to Korea along the Yellow Sea. The person who really brought Buddhism from China to Korea was also incidentally an Indian monk called Malananda. In fact, Malananda was there in the Chinese imperial court. He had moved from what is today Pakistan, Takshila, Gandhara, which they call it traditionally. He had moved from Gandhara to China, and impressed by the teachings he brought from India, the Chinese then really quote unquote exported him to Korea. And in Korea, he then influenced the Baekje rulers, who were actually a maritime power. The Baekje Empire was there. And it was these Koreans who then spread the message further into Japan. So we are familiar with that story. Chinese, to their credit, actually preserved a lot of Buddhism because India had the oral tradition, and they also, whatever textual material was there in monasteries like Nalanda, the Chinese painstakingly translated them. So even when the manuscripts were lost due to certain events, it was the core of Buddhism was preserved by China. But that is the collaboration between Imperial China and India in far history. But what we have now, after the formation of the PRC, that is the People's Republic of China in 1949, there is a competition between India and China. There have been areas of collaboration, but the essential competition between the two, not just countries, but two civilizations, has been quite extensive. And that's where ownership of Buddhism has become an issue between India and China. So in this competition for the appropriation of Buddhism, the Chinese are making their moves. Now, what are they? The Chinese have an organization called the Buddhist Association of China. That is an organization which was formed way back in 1952, but it's highly active, especially recently, in conducting many international conferences by inviting guests, especially from the region, including Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, or wherever else, Sri Lanka. And apart from these conferences and the ideation which takes place in them, the Chinese are doing something much more important and institutional. There is a city called Lingshan in China, and Lingshan is now being attempted to be converted into a Vatican for Buddhism. In other words, a city like the Vatican, which will be the core of Buddhism, and from where influence of Buddhism will radiate in a certain direction to the followers of the faith, which is vast and covers several geographies, not just Southeast Asia and South Asia, but also countries like Mongolia, for example, parts of Russia. So it is a very major step to make sure, again, that the ownership, quote unquote, ownership of Buddhism is there with China. And ideationally, ideologically, the Chinese have overwhelming influence over the followers of Buddhism. Now, while this is taking place, there is a riposte to this which is coming, and this is coming from India. And in India, of late, I'm sure you have already noticed that Kushinagar has become an international airport. Now, Kushinagar was a place where the Buddha passed away. Lumbini is a city or a location in Nepal where the Prime Minister had visited, and that is the birthplace of the Buddha. That is being revived. Bodh Gaya is being revived. There's also an attempt to reseed the teachings of Buddhism in India. That is, since Buddhism moved away from India and there is a shortage or a shortfall of teachers of Buddhism, the masters of Buddhism, there is an attempt to bring masters from outside into Bodh Gaya to train Indians so that the faith can be revived, or the practice or the life or the way of life of Buddha is really revived back in India. So there is this attempt, and it is not India which is going out alone in forming this so-called Buddhist circuit. In fact, there are countries, especially Japan, which is playing a very major role in this. The Koreans are involved in this exercise. Now, Thailand is like a swing player if you look at it in the way of geopolitics, because it has a very good relationship with China, yet it has, again, a very nuanced and a credible relationship both with India and with Japan. So we will see how this pans out now. This soft power, balance of power, to put it, on the question of the ownership of Buddhism. And it is in this context that this particular conference takes place in Thimpu. It is part of this bigger process. And Thimpu, why? As I said earlier, the reason being that Bhutan is on the borders of China, and it is again a pivot in terms of the overall sort of spread of Buddhism. If Bhutan gets co-opted with China, then that will be a big victory for the China on the soft power plane. So Bhutan is a very critical state, which in a very definite way will influence the way the competition on Buddhism or the spread of Buddhism between India and China manifests itself in the future. There are two other takeaways which I want to raise with you. One is that what is happening or what has happened in Thimpu and the events which I spoke before is really to reinforce one very major ideological strand of New India. That is the recreation of India or the revival of India as a civilizational state. Now, India has been a liberal democracy, it remains a democracy. But instead of being influenced by the West, there is a cautious attempt to root India and the idea of India into its civilizational ethos. And within that, Buddhism is a very, very important element. So there is, if you recall, the Prime Minister when the Rajpath was changed, the name was changed to Kartavya Path, and even before, in the 15th August address, he spoke about 5 principles which we need to be followed, or And one of them was really the decolonization of the mind. Now, that's a very important civilizational project where you see India with a de-Westernized mind, not an anti-Western mind, but a de-Westernized mind. And so this entire exercise of getting back to roots, on our civilizational roots, well, the Thimpu conference was another element which went into promoting that very idea of India as a civilizational state. Finally, it's important that when the world is talking about the clash of civilizations, that there is a faith or way of life, because I don't think Buddhists like to call themselves as a religion in a very classical sense, but really a way of life, which talks of peace and harmony and collaboration among humanity, which needs to find its place in the global ideological pantheon to counter negative, divisive, and extremist ideologies. I think there is another element to why Buddhism needs to be revived and find its due place in the ideational world. I think these are the three elements which sort of got reflected or are the thinking behind why a conference like this took place in Thimpu and the other initiatives which follow. Now, it's not necessary that what is happening now remains a point of permanent competition between India and China. The two civilizations have cooperated with each other, but it is very important, in my view, for China to understand that just as there is a Confucian world, you can see that from China going up to the Koreas and parts of Japan. There is also a vast region in Asia when it is the Indian idiom which is prominent. It is the Indian civilizational influence that one can see right from Sri Lanka. You go eastwards, you get into Indonesia, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia. The Chinese have to understand that just as they have their own geo-cultural space, India too has its own geo-cultural space. And the moment when mutual respect starts on each civilization's geo-cultural bandwidth, I think the better it would be, and we would be moving on a track where we can be looking at solutions rather than going into problems. I will stop here and would be happy to meet you again on another episode of Under the Radar. Keep watching and keep sending your feedback.